infectious diseases, research, medicine, health. Welcome to Outbreak News Interviews. And now, broadcasting from the Outbreak News Skylar Studios in beautiful West Central Florida, here is your host, microbiologist and editor of OutbreakNewsToday.com, Robert Harriman.
Hey everybody, this is Robert, and welcome to Outbreak News Interviews. And today we're going to look at a little bit of history. Now, Shoko Asahara, the founder of the doomsday cult Aum Shinrikyo, and mastermind behind the deadly 1995 nerve gas attack in the Tokyo subway system, and a multitude of other crimes and acts of terror, and 6 other members of the cult were recently executed in Japan. Joining me to take a look at the cult Aum Shinrikyo and the acts of terror they committed is Laboure College professor and biodefense expert Lawrence Roberge, PhD. Dr. Roberge, welcome back to the show, sir.
It's a great honor and pleasure to be with you again, Robert.
Okay, let's take a look back at this terror doomsday cult.
Sure.
Who is or was, maybe they still exist, Aum Shinrikyo, and what was the genesis behind them?
Basically, you had this blind prophet who took some mixture of Buddhism and some other concepts and mashed them together, and this was occurring, I believe, in the late 80s, early 90s when he started to accumulate followers and people. Now, what they always predicted was that there was going to be a great time of basic societal collapse, basic societal upheaval, and perhaps even the end of the world. What eventually started happening is they started to develop strategies to try to hasten this, okay? And what you end up having is they had accumulated a variety of people of high intelligence, education, status, etc., that became his followers, all right? And what happened with this individual was that he was able to manipulate them, like a lot of cults do, to do things and to follow with this mindset of, you're doing the right thing, this is what we want, this is what you're doing, you're following the right way, the right pathway, even though, most conventional thinking would be saying, what, are you crazy? Mm-hmm. And there is a lot that's remembered about the nerve gas attack in the subways, but there were a variety of other projects they had attempted to do that either failed because they weren't able to get the basic materials, or they failed because they used the wrong materials. I hope that's helpful there.
Okay, now the leader, the founder, was executed. Several other members from back then in the 90s. Do they still exist today?
I believe there's still some fragments and remnants hiding using other names, etc. But the main leader was executed. And now some people would sit there and say, wow, you have to understand that Japan as a culture does not, as a society, they really, really do not favor death penalty. It's a very, very exceedingly rare instance. And as their Minister of Justice had clarified, she basically said, look, this is so heinous of crimes that we have to have this punishment there. And so the top officials, including the leader, were executed. Now, you got to take this seriously, because that's how different this is. I mean, when you hear something today in the United States culture, so-and-so was executed in Texas, they were executed in this state or in that state, we had that somewhat common, but it's not as common in some other countries. It's almost unheard of in other countries. And Japan is one of these. They had always presumed that they were a peaceful society, that they were, that this type of stuff wouldn't happen, etc. And I might also add that they had, this cult had actually followers going over into Siberia. So over into sort of the eastern part of Russia, or the Russian Federation. And this was really something that was unusual. They were able to go over into different countries, etc. But death penalty was something that they had to really issue out because it had so shaken the country and the society.
Now, in their prime, I guess in the mid-90s, how large of a cult was this? Hundreds, thousands?
I had heard somewhere in the range of thousands, perhaps 10,000.
Yeah.
But, there are estimates, and there are people that were very much into it and others that were more fringe. But what was scary about it was that it really reached into the depths of some of the members who were quite brilliant. In other words, this wasn't just common low, poor educated, shiftless individuals. These were some very, very brilliant individuals. These were some very skilled individuals, etc.
So you mentioned that part of their motivation was to hasten the end of the world, more or less. Let's look at some of the larger things that they did. They were involved in a number of crimes and acts of terror, but in 1993, they attempted to spray anthrax spores off of a roof in Tokyo. What's the story behind that?
Well, what was happening was, as part of their trying to bring on the end of the world, they had issued this development of anthrax. But here's the thing. The anthrax they used was really just a crude, it was more for making a, what you would call vaccine. In other words, it was a strain of anthrax that was really not a type that would really cause disease. That was one flaw. Mm-hmm. The second flaw was when they discharged it, the wind had dissipated this away from the American consulate. Okay, and this was really fortunate for us, but it really didn't alert us as quickly as later on when we really saw these events occurring, with the nerve gas issue. Now, there were several other instances where they attempted to use anthrax, and they really didn't make it. They didn't cause an anthrax epidemic or anything else like that. And these were against individuals, particularly law enforcement that was trying to investigate them. And so they turned their interest more into using nerve agents such as Sarin and VX.
Right. And that segues right into my next question. A year later, in 1994, they carried out a sarin gas attack in Matsumoto. Dr. Roberge, first, what is sarin gas, and what's the story behind that attack?
Okay, sarin is one of the earlier generation nerve agents, and what this is basically it acts on the enzyme acetylcholinesterase. Now, let me just help you with this. The movement of all of our muscles and certain acetylcholine neurotransmitters in the brain all basically are dependent upon the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. And when the signal gets sent from one cell to the other, the receiving cell will bind to the neurotransmitter. But then the neurotransmitter pops off of the receptor. And rather than just lingering around there, there's an enzyme there that will break it down. It's called acetylcholinesterase. Mm-hmm. Now, sarin has the capability to shut down the actual act or effectiveness of that enzyme. When it does, the person is going to basically be flooded with their own acetylcholine. And so it's like keeping the light switch on all the time. Now, that doesn't sound like much, but you have to think about this. You have to do what when you breathe? Well, you have this big muscle called the diaphragm. You have the muscles in between the ribs. And so you have to basically contract and then relax. Contract and then relax. If you don't, you're not going to be able, you can probably take a breath in, but you won't be able to relax it and let the breath come out. And this is part of the whole problem. What sarin does is it jams up all of the muscular connections because they're almost as if they're all turned on. But it's not just with breathing. It also affects the central nervous system. Now, when these individuals were exposed, they were all in a subway car. The individual, one of the followers, went down, had a bottle. I think it was either a sort of a leather case, or I think it was more of a paper bag, and broke the container as he was walking out when the subway car stopped. And the chemical reaction started. The chemical normally is more viscous. It doesn't easily turn into a vapor. It takes a little time. And so by the time the next stop happened, the vapors were both in the car, overcoming and killing some of the passengers, but they were also spreading out into that subway station. And also, as air currents would travel, they would be passed on to some of the other stations. This was all an attempt to create their doomsday, to create social chaos. Now, it took some time for their chemists to figure out how to make it. It took their chemists some time to design it, but it was definitely with a forethought and an intent. Now, the reason why I bring this up is because we all dabble sometimes hearing, well, first-degree murder, second-degree murder, this, etc. This was planned out. It was a planned mass execution, if you want to say, or a planned event of a weapons of mass destruction. Now, what did we end up with in the end? Approximately 100 people had died. Now, you have to also keep in mind something. There are about 1,000 or more who had neurological damage and still suffer from it to this day because they got lower dosages of it. And they were also had problems with recovering from it. You see, Tokyo was not prepared for a weapon of mass destruction like a nerve gas attack. Most societies in the 1990s would say the same thing. They had to rush medical people in. They had to get people out of the subway. They had to get them breathing. They had to try to use various drugs to counteract the effects of sarin. Sarin has an unusual capability also. It can bind briefly to the enzyme and paralyze the enzyme, or it can eventually covalently, that is, chemically bond with that enzyme, rendering it completely unrecoverable. Now you say, well, doesn't the body make more enzymes? Yes, but that takes a lot of time. In the meantime, the person is being flooded with acetylcholine, the switch is on, and there's no way to reverse this. Now, normally there's two drugs that the military uses. One is atropine, which handles the overload of the acetylcholine. But paramoxidine is a counteragent. It basically would break away the sarin from the acetylcholinesterase, but you have to give it within a short period of time from the actual exposure. Otherwise, the sarin will become covalently, that is, chemically bonded to the enzyme, and then it's not reversible. Some of the people were saved as a result of the very brave and very alert first responders that first came in and got them out into the air, etc. Sadly, others died, and sadly, others were partially injured from that attack.
Dr. Roberge, are you talking about the Tokyo attack or the Matsumoto attack?
Oh, I'm sorry. The Matsumoto was I stand corrected.
Yeah.
I was talking about the Tokyo attack. The Matsumoto one
was the refrigerator truck.
The refrigerator truck, yeah. And then they tried to release a cloud of sarin.
Yeah.
And it was directed toward the homes of judges who were overseeing a lawsuit. Excuse me for a second. I'm going to put something away. I've got, I'm sorry.
No problem.
The Matsumoto incident killed about 8 people and harmed about, 500 more.
Yeah.
It was more directed at judges who were overseeing a lawsuit that was involved with a real estate dispute that was going on against the cult. See, here's the thing. They also use these weapons against people in the sense of legislators or law enforcement that had either investigations or legal conflicts with them.
So the the officials, the police and all that in Japan, they didn't know that the cult was behind the Matsumoto
That's
attack.
Right. They didn't know. They didn't understand that this cult was involved with the Matsumoto attack, and it was really only after the Tokyo subway attack.
Yeah.
Now, I ask for your patience and forgiveness here because I did get the big focus has always been on the Tokyo attack because I think it gained a lot more attention, and also the fact was that I think really it had a higher death rate and was seen in press worldwide. Yeah. Now, these folks were not just involved with just those two incidents. They were also involved with using VX gas.
Right.
Now, VX stands really for venomous. It was actually a product by British scientists after World War II. They made the next generation. And it also does the same process of blocking acetylcholinesterase. They used it to attack 3 people. 2 of the persons were injured. One was killed. And he is actually, that one person that was killed was first believed to be the first victim of VX ever documented. And it's very sad because a lot of this was going on and people were not as much aware of this. And what I mean by that is just basically, no one in the 1990s had expected that nerve gas would be something that smaller, organized groups or criminal organizations would be using these type of weapons. They were more thought to be that, this will be something you'll see in a battlefield, maybe in World War III, versus NATO versus Warsaw Pact or something like that. This, unfortunately, was something that they had created as part of this mentality that they are going to try to bring on, the end of the world.
Okay, and we've already talked a little bit about the 1995 attack on the subway. Is there any other final thoughts about that particular attack? The one that most people are aware of.
The one that most of the folks are aware of has really gained a lot of scientific interest, and it's basically one of these types that motivates a lot of CBRN, which is chemical, nuclear, biological individuals, radiological and nuclear. When they talk about weapons of mass destruction, up until, let's say, about the 1980s, early 1990s, everybody had thought about World War III. What does the USSR have? What does the U.S. have? What are the treaties, etc.? Everything has kind of spun much more looser now because we realize that dedicated individuals can, and do in some cases, release weapons of mass destruction such as nerve gas or hydrogen cyanide or VX gas. I mean, the Aum Shinrikyo, I mispronounce it, but I mean, this is what I remember studying over it. They were trying to find also weapons such as Anthrax and Ebola cultures, and had actually sent some individuals out to Africa to try to get an effective Ebola culture. Mm-hmm. Asahara, which was the leader, is basically one that Shinrikyo Asahara was the leader, and he has died. For a while, he tried to play this out, because I remember that he was really convicted much earlier than 2018, but he tried to play himself off as, blind or demented or this or that, and eventually it didn't convince the Japanese law enforcement at all. I would say now, this is assigned to many other countries. I mean, when you talk about weapons of mass destruction today, they use both military and civilians, the lone wolves, the cult-like organizations, the criminal syndicates, and say, look, this stuff can happen much more easily today than it could ever happen in our history previously. And that's why we have to have a much more well-informed, not only public, but also a well-informed first responders and law enforcement, because they're realizing that, the genie's out of the bottle. Mm-hmm. anybody can basically put together some chemicals and make some type of horrible weapon. I was talking with some friends a while back, and I said, look at, I remember when it was a craze. You remember the Tide pods where kids were sitting there and trying to eat them and show that on YouTube. Okay. Well, I can go back a few years earlier than that where kids were taking and mixing one type of alcohol, I won't mention what, with some chlorine bleach and putting it together in one of the little, like 1 pint or 1 liter bottles and throwing it over, and you'd see this discharge of green gas. Well, that discharge of green gas is pure chlorine gas.
Mm-hmm.
So the main point I'm trying to say is that there are people now that can do this, even at a high school level, okay? And they think it's for kicks. But we really have to be a lot more aware of these type of things. Just to extend one point, subways. I remember about 1 or 2 years ago, there was a big brouhaha in Boston, and where I teach is nearby in Boston. And I had been going through and work and traveling using some of the subways in Boston, and they were attempting to understand how air circulates and flows around inside those subways so that their studies could help them to prepare in case there was a chemical weapons attack or a radiological attack or even a biological agent attack in those subways. Of course, everyone got bananas about it. It was like, well, why are you doing this, et cetera, and with people around. Well, they were using a harmless agent. I think they were using like a xenon gas or something else like that. But the main point was they had study stations at different places, and it was helpful for them. These studies are necessary. No, we don't want to make people human guinea pigs, but we want to be prepared in case those people are attacked by, shall we just say it, the bad guys. And we have to be ready to know, well, if this agent is dispersed here, how far can it travel? How far do we have to decontaminate? If you think about it, recently we had that sad situation of Novichok in UK. And it was a month after the event that 2 other people got very sick. One sadly died. Mm-hmm. And that raises the question, did they decontaminate enough? Or was there a second dosage of the material that someone got exposed to for one reason or another? And there's still a lot of questions still coming out on that.
Okay. Dr. Roberge, let me close with this question.
Sure.
Now, it's been almost 25 years since the Tokyo subway attack.
Right.
Have we seen anything that compares to the devastation since then? Anything of that magnitude?
We have not seen, I'll be honest with you, I don't think that we've seen from the sense of a chemical warfare attack at that level. Thank goodness. Yeah. I am sure, and I hear once in a while the hintings of it, that some of them have been interrupted beforehand. One case is an individual who was part of British intelligence, and basically a little after 2001, I think it was around 2003, Al-Qaeda was planning on using either hydrogen chloride or cyanogen chloride in the New York Lincoln tunnels. Now, that would have caused a very high casualty rate. Mm-hmm. And they had worked out how to make the bombs and how, using basic chemicals you can get at hardware stores, et cetera, and the buckets and all that other stuff. And they actually showed from the CIA, they showed it to President Bush then and said, this is how it would have worked, and it would have caused casualties. I think that because we have certain infiltrations, agents, moles, in some of these very, very reactive and very dangerous organizations, now that we can get a hinting of whether something is going to occur. And so we've probably had a number of events that have been interrupted or stopped.
Well, that's good to know.
Well, that's good to know, right? But
yeah.
but let us not just sit on our laurels, because to be honest with you, like they just had in the press recently that they interrupted the first possible bio attack using ricin in Germany.
Yeah, I saw that.
And this hit the press, and now Germany is sitting there going, "Wow, we dodged a bullet." Well, it's nice to dodge the bullet, and thank goodness for that. But we have to be alert, because unfortunately there are a lot of other people that think of these things.
Well,
does that help?
Yes, it's perfect. And I want to thank you, Dr. Lawrence Roberge, for your time and your expertise on this topic. I appreciate it.
No problem, anytime.
If you are worried you have Lyme disease, or just like the outdoors, and want the peace of mind of knowing whether you have Lyme disease or not, there is a new Lyme screening test based on decades of research by Dr. Richard Marconi, a professor at VCU Medical Center. For more information, visit glymedx.com. That's glymedx.com. Or email at info@glymedx.com.